If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers Podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
Hey everybody, it's Steve. Welcome back to Studio 26. Today, I am joined by Glenn. Glenn, it's great to have you on the show. Give us a quick introduction about who you are.
Thanks, Steve. I am Glenn LaFollette, content marketer, storyteller for brands. Very happy to be here to talk about all things content and content marketing.
All right, cool. And we've done a number of episodes so far, so all of these loyal listeners know how we do the show. We always open up with the case studies. This is your chance to share a story with us from your experiences. So we're going to jump right into that. And the first case study is all about how to do a brand launch the right way. And it's a little bit of a trick question or a trick statement because the launch is always a very old school way to do the brand launch, right? Like it's always that we're going to pick a date and we're going to go for that date and there's pre-launch and there's launch and there's post-launch. But anyway, I don't want to steal your thunder. I don't like being the thunder stealer, but I'm excited to hear the story. Take it away, Glenn.
In terms of, I was trying to think of examples from our past that would fit. I find that in many of the roles I've been in, content is usually a problem solver. So a lot of my experience has been, tactical solutions to strategies that are missing something. And I think that's always true with brand launches because they're difficult. Usually they're the thing that everyone has the most opinions about, and you do a lot of work to get a new vision for a company, the words, the fonts, the colors, which it's easy to feel like it's just those things, but it's usually middle grounding and fighting to figure out what the essence of a place is. And what usually gets missed is that you do all that work, and when you get to the end, you want to tell people that you've rebranded. And really, the missing piece is that you want to show people your brand, I think, and not just tell them that you've rebranded. And so it's like launching a new website. Don't tell people you launched a new website. Give them a nugget, something interesting worth going there. And so for brand, in a lot of cases, if you're solving the problem of missing something to help activate a brand launch, I think it comes down to finding a story that really highlights what it is you're about, whether it's about, authenticity or empathy or the way you help clients. Like there's something there, and it could be about your people. It could be about, your clients. And so I was in a situation with a global company where it's not necessarily a mistake, but got to the launch point and we didn't really have a way to explain to people to bring that brand to life. And so what we chose to do is we put our heads together and said, look, you've got to be able to kind of absorb the brand through something. And we picked a magazine, a brand magazine. And what that allowed us to do, not that, we were trying to bring print journalism back, it was more just contextualized for people through stories. And so we looked at kind of the things that you do when you're trying to tell stories about yourselves. Like, what do we know a lot about? Where are places we've helped clients in unique ways? Who are the personalities that should be included in this? You kind of just pick your best mix of things. And so my role in that was as editor, kind of bring some of that together. And we were a company that did tons of thought leadership, but thought leadership is not the same thing as like those kinds of stories that you have in something like a brand mag. It doesn't mean that it's super promotional either. It's not just an echo of a press release. It's something that is about people, human moments. And fortunately for our company, the company was very much focused on a brand that was human forward. And so it made it easy to kind of find stories that affected people or about people. And that's what we did. We took things that were, trends, situations where we help clients, interesting topics that we found, and either through the voice of someone or, hopefully from a client that was doing something really interesting. We pick and chose those stories were very much magazine style articles about each of those and then package it together. And that was, tons of work to kind of, you're a global firm, global company. And so you could pick a lot of things. And so, we probably had more than we could possibly write about, but you pick the things that build the most precedent. We gave the magazine a theme to kind of fit what was going on in the world at that point. And then those stories were meant to kind of give you something to physically, like as a new hire for the company, you could pick up and immediately kind of understand what we're about. You could also, fortunately, take that and give it to our sales team, and they could put it in the hands of clients. And that's what we did. And so, we saw that it was definitely the first couple issues were definitely the most downloaded thing that year. And certainly some of that's from having a larger push, but we were kind of doing this with people that could write. I mean, we weren't built to create that sort of thing. But when we got to the brand launch, we looked around at people that were interested in kind of like whether a designer, a writer, marketers across the company. We found a coalition of the willing to help put it together, and they kind of grew that team out because we thought it was important to make sure that people understood from our new brand positioning, our brand promise, that this is the thing that you can kind of download, immediately dive into, that helps you understand why we did this, who we are, what we're about. And my favorite result of that is not just that it was downloaded a lot. You can tell a story and it can be applicable to candidates. It can be applicable to prospects. It can be applicable to people that you're trying to retain from a business standpoint. Like, you need things like that. And it doesn't have to be a magazine. It just means that when you rebrand, find a way to tell that story in some form that connects. And it's usually not, just something that repeats the brand tagline back to the clients or the prospects. It's something that sort of brings your people and your mission to life.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I've been doing marketing for about 25 years. When I started out, there was very much a formula about how to do the brand relaunch. And it was all about the general or the brand agency that defined the look and the feel. So it was very much here's the logo, here's the tagline, here's how we lock it up. And now that we have this done, we're going to do, a series of 3 print ads and a, 1 or 2 60-second TV spots. And it was always like the brand anthem, launch. And it's fascinating how, fast forward to today, you have to do that. Obviously, that those are components of your brand, but I'm seeing more companies get smart about the activation work. So yes, you can have a beautiful design system, but if it doesn't activate well, it fails. Or, in a similar way, companies can be so strong on the graphic standards of a brand, but then when they get to like, well, what do we talk about? It's just like, I don't know, how do we bring this to life? Like, we can't just look to buy print ads so we can put the logo in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'm glad on this story that you got to a point where you realized you have to activate. And from my understanding too, on this one, you're talking about a magazine, but then that content was also a little bit, you could leverage that into other channels. Maybe talk about how the magazine was the rallying point. How did you leverage that other content?
Yeah, it is effectively, it's storytelling, and storytelling inevitably reaches other mediums. Probably the best example is that we were pretty efficient and creative around what we did with client stories. You assume safely that you're going to distribute this content, whether through paid SEO-based articles or even slides that are for your sales force. You kind of have to pick a story that is good across all those. Like, it's going to have a testimonial quote. It's an interesting client. It's got hopefully some key stat that is amazing. And if you don't have those, you lean into one of the others, because inevitably some client stories are just you're pitching a lot of airlines, and so it's a major airline, that kind of thing. But I'd say we were always guilty of testimonials or case studies being just a quote, right? And so to flesh that out, you had to go through hoops of approvals and, find the right candidate that could be something that could be a multi-touch story like that. And we found a few. And we obviously, because our brand is very much human focused, we tried to pick one with interesting humans, but something that would both convey the brand, but also when you got down to a slide, or in what we ended up doing, having multiple edits of, say, a video, it told a story for someone that you wanted to pitch for business. And so we would take a client story, we would evaluate it to see if it fit all those different story points along a customer journey. And you would do a print article and then a minute to 2 minute version of that story with a sit-down interview, B-roll footage, something that was very accessible if you did not know who we are. We were probably 10 seconds of that first video, lightly mentioned, or the source for the quotes in those initial articles. We were putting the spotlight on the client, which is your goal with that top of funnel stuff. But then as you got down into it, we did other edits that were the things that a sales team typically wants and honestly needs, because when you're at a certain point in the sales cycle, you want them to hear from another client that's like, hey, they did a great job for us, or they went the extra mile.
Yep.
They did this amazing thing. And so we looked at the content, edited it at different points, had different versions. They all echoed each other, which, you don't have to, because it's not like somebody starts at the first, watches the video, watches the second one, looks at a slide. But inevitably, if they do get exposed to some of those client stories, you want them all to feel coherent, to echo your brand and sort of a similar journey. And so we did that work. And most of it was in just trying to find someone who would let us come in, talk to them, share their story. And if we did really good work as a company for them, they typically go on that journey. And I think what was interesting, Steve, is even from the promotional standpoint, we got a lot of pushback, as I'm sure every marketer, particularly B2B, gets. It's like, people don't want to read they want to watch video. Well, people don't want to watch long videos. Like there's always some edit to your content. And the thing is, we had a model that tried everything. Even we did a pretty sizable LinkedIn campaign for some of our client stories, and we tested 30-second cuts that teased back to the story or a longer video. We did 60-second cuts, and then we did full length videos that had like a 5 to 6 second little teaser at the front to be like, the video is about this, which 100% I just stole from movie trailers. That was happening at the time because our attention spans are so short.
Yeah.
I remember like the Jason Bourne trailer was one of the first I saw that did this. It's just like, hey, here's a teaser for a teaser. And that seems insane, but in today's world, that's how you get people's attention. And when we tested those videos against each other using a 30-second, 60-second, a full length with a teaser, the most engagement came from the one with the teaser, because people will watch, like, heard Mark Maron say this, it's like people will watch something they won't watch. That's not every brand story that's out there, but you probably have a good story to tell and a creative way to tell it. And the key is look at your audience, look at where they are in the journey. It's going to be a different cut. And it's probably something we're all guilty of based on resources, time, or just the demand of a senior leader. You make something that's the same on every spot, and it's not going to be as effective. You have to look at those stories and be like, what part am I telling and where? And that's what we did. And every company probably has something like that if they can find the right story, the right candidate, the right partner.
Yeah. I think that's a great example of, I hear this all the time with medium to long form content. The argument is always people don't have time. And while I agree that like people do like short and snackable depending on the medium, I always push back on that. And here's why. So let's go to the extreme. Let's say it's a thought leadership thing, right? You're doing a 15, 20 page report, white paper, whatever it may be. The journalism and editorial purist out there will look at that and say the goal is to get that person to read it cover to cover. And if it takes them 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's fine. That's the goal. We're going to create the content in that spirit. I don't agree with that. To me, the whole idea is create the white paper. The whole goal of white paper is for you to be perceived as knowledgeable. So if you produce a piece of content that takes 20 minutes to get through, and someone only spends 7 or 8, or they read the first page or 2 and then they skim the rest, that's fine. You have told them you are an expert and you have the ability to write long form. It doesn't mean, you have to say, well, we did a survey and we know that people love short form content. Therefore, it's only 30-second videos. We're not going to do anything longer than that. So I'm a big believer in the yes, play the short game and also play the long game, because you can't just cut everything off because not everyone's going to consume the content.
Agreed. And particularly with thought leadership is the best example. And a little bit, this is any thought leadership I've ever produced in my career. There is something to it is a bit of a show of force. And honestly, the magazines, we did 3 when I was there, and each of them could have been 10 pages shorter, but there is something to you're trying to mix an amount of things that make this thing feel like a tentpole moment, something that's worth downloading, something that, as you just highlighted, it shows that you know what you're talking about. And I don't know that there's really a KPI for that, there is a sense for, I spend 30 seconds on Forrester Gardner, a major researcher, they know what they're doing. And so you want your brand to feel that way, depending on, again, thought leadership is your lean, but if you know something, you have to show them that you know it. And there's just, it's worth trying dense things. It's worth trying short things. It's worth trying to kind of have a buffet of that. But the key is that it's all true to you, right? It's, if you're a stodgy brand, don't only have Snapchat videos, it's there's a mix. But the flip side of that is, it's amazing how long any of us, I'm sure it's generationally based, but we'll look at TikTok, right? We'll spend hours watching short things, but for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So you look at what you have, and I think that's why it's worth trying different things.
Yeah, and especially too, in the most extreme long form example, like a white paper, it takes 20 minutes. Out of 100 people, there are going to be 3 people who finish that white paper, let's just say. And in the B2B world, if someone goes that deep and they're your buyer, you've captured their attention span for 20 minutes, and that's all you might need to do. I want to circle back to one part that you mentioned before, which is interesting, is, you use the magazine as a tool to connect it to the sales force. And that's really important because most marketing people do not think that way as far as how do you connect it to the salespeople. I have a similar example from a launch that I did. It was the marketing play here was B2B2C, right? So we wanted to influence this group of maybe 1,000 people who influence the consumers. And it was a brand launch. We were tight on media budget, and the whole brand was trying to reposition itself as a luxury brand. They didn't have luxury dollars, but they had luxury aspirations. And what we had done was we actually bought the industry publication that was the clear leader, right? It was like, hey, if you're advertising in that publication, you've got money to spend because it's really expensive. We bought regional media buys of that publication to get the price way down. We did a lot of custom inserts into the thing. So it was essentially like a 4-page spread. It was like, the media people probably have a word for it. It's probably called like a spectacular, where it's like, you can't help but notice this thing because it's going to scream when you open the magazine. So we then ordered, 500, 1,000 copies of these regional publications, gave them to everyone at the sales kickoff. We said, now go back into your respective meetings. When you have your intro meetings, give them this magazine. And the first reaction, and their audience didn't know how to buy media, right? They just said, oh my God, you guys bought an ad in the most expensive trade publication. It was such a clever way to engage the salespeople and to make the clients out there think that this was a brand that went big and they were investing a lot of money behind this launch. And so that helped with that perception. And then the other thing I love about any physical thing is if you spend the money and you give something to someone like that, they will not throw it away immediately. Eventually it will be thrown away, but there should be a metric around like time spent sitting on desk. Like when you give that to someone, if that sits on their desk for 2 weeks, there is value in that because they were going back, they were looking at it. So I'm glad you touched on that. What did the sales force say, like as it related to like that tangible piece? Did they think it helped?
A mix of reactions. I mean, that was of this journey. You don't make these kinds of things alone. Of course, like to your point, there's a certain level of, like, if you're going to do, even if it's a bespoke landing page or a part of your website, like there is something like this has to pop. And so, whether it's sitting on a desk at an event or being handed to somebody, it needs to look amazing. And so like we spent a lot of time, many partners working together to kind of figure out what would work on the tactic side. How is getting people's hands? Do we need to put something extra on it, like a band? We tried stuff like that. And a lot of those ideas came from people doing, business development roles who were working hand in hand with Salesforce, because it is one thing to hand it to them, but maybe you want a QR code on there that drives back to a particular page. Like we tried things like that. And most of the time at events, right, where we'd be handing out like 1,000. But I have great respect for my partners in events marketing and who come up with clever ideas like that to be like, it's not just handing you something they'll throw away in 5 minutes. It's, there's some message on there that ties them specifically. The reactions were always that this looks great. Clients like it, broadly speaking. But we kind of had to tailor it in delivery, right? So sometimes it was paired with, if it was like Dallas or Houston, something local, like a brochure or something, to kind of like be a bundle. But in a lot of cases, it went to a lot of events and into a lot of meeting handoffs, that kind of thing. And so the response was always, if you're talking to sales, like they need a regular flow of content, they need some of those, like something that's more than a brochure. And so broadly speaking, it fit a need to kind of keep a conversation going, have something they could send, something that was different than just a set of charts, right? And so we would work with them to make sure that there was something special about it if we could. But a lot of those ideas came from people that were on the ground. And we were happy to accommodate, because when you're making that kind of content, usually it's like you've given birth and someone's asked you about where are you enrolling them in school, right? You're like, hold on. So you have to have partners to kind of figure that out and just make sure that the baby gets where it needs to go. And usually the reaction was very positive.
Yeah. The event marketing thing is its own beast. I mean, I do have a lot of respect for those folks. I'll interject a random story from what I thought was one of the best event marketing activations. So this was, and you would never think that out of my mouth will come the words, this really innovative thing from the post office. But the post office was trying to do, raising awareness of why not use the post office instead of FedEx or DHL, right? Like it was kind of like, use us to send stuff to your clients. And this was at South by Southwest years ago. And their whole pitch was like, they built a booth. It looked like a post office. And they were like, you're getting a lot of materials from the show. Just bring it here. We'll ship it free back to your office and it's going to arrive before you get home. And it was such a powerful, like it had utility. They proved their service, right? It wasn't just like hey, we can get it there X days faster. Anyway, little bit of segue how I thought that was a really cool event activation. Any other parts of the first case study before we go on to the second one?
No, I think the lessons I would, again, mention the idea that sometimes you are looking for content to solve problems you have, but usually it can. And it doesn't mean that your strategy is not sound. It just means that ideas like a magazine, video series, whatever it is, inevitably you can fill in sort of gaps with these kinds of things. And so I think that people that are associated with a brand relaunch, just remember that when you get to that day, there has to be something there that shows that off and is not literally just telling people, that you've done all this work. It's easy to get in that. We all have been there, but you have to think through activation. You have to think through how to activate, and somewhere within your company is a story worth telling, and have some fun. Try some things to figure out what is the best way to bring that to life, because inevitably it's not just one video or one article or a press release. It's going to be a mix of things.
Yeah. All right, cool. Nice case. We're going to jump into case number 2. And I'm just going to refer to this as the magical case because it involves a lot of magic. Take it away.
For sure. I think that everyone has dealt with the challenge of shifting to conference calls, virtual events. I mean, there's been such good work in the space, right? When we were all just kind of figuring out as we go. For example, a company I was working for doing tons of client events made the shift to cleverly hire people to do like virtual wine tastings. And I usually got to go to those, and it was amazing. And so like I was happy to have something to break up the monotony of being trapped at home during that first year of pandemic. But when you're talking about events that used to be like a happy hour or something where you're engaging in person, it's just so challenging to replicate that experience. Like, how do you keep people engaged? And I think on the bad end of the spectrum, like a lot of people try to, it's a flood of like inside jokes or people that aren't actors trying to do work. And it can be fine for a while, but like if you try to run a whole virtual event with that kind of thing, it is tough. And so one of the companies I worked for, we had to sponsor an hour before a giant industry award ceremony. And so you want people to see your logo, but you want them to associate positive feelings with your brand. And it's something to where you would have been elbow to elbow sharing drinks. That's a different scenario than trying to do what you and I are doing now to be engaging, to make sure people understand your brand, but also come away with a good experience. And we put our heads together, and I pitched ideas like trying to use local groups that could do like improv, to host people that would be good MCs or that can make the hour kind of speed by with jokes and that sort of thing. And my manager at the time was like, no, I want a magician. And it's the first time I've ever been asked to hire a magician. And thought he was crazy and was skeptical about it the whole way, and immediately searched for like 5 or 6 other options and put those in front of him. And he's like, nah, I've seen this guy before. Let's do it. And we talked to someone who was based out of Vegas, not like your uncle, or something. And every meeting we had with them, I was skeptical that it wouldn't work. And then the day of, a lot of the challenges were around, how does the technology work? Like, how are you? He was doing illusionist-based work. We're trying to figure out, like, how does he interact with everybody? Or are we projecting small interaction with a larger group? Like, it was technically very complicated. After a few interactions with this individual, I was like, well, he does seem engaging and entertaining. And then the day of the show, I mean, I'm shocked how wrong I was, because he was doing things like calling out people that were even in our office or in other offices and having them guess things like Australia or kangaroos or whatever that, they would write on a card in the office with us, but yet he hadn't spoken to them in advance. And we all loved it. And it was a great show. And it was one of those things where like, I try to now take as like good ideas can come from anywhere. And particularly when it comes to virtual events, like you have to try stuff. Like I thought this was insane. It would go terribly, but I might have just fallen in the same trap that we used to, where like you try to pick some group to kind of do what you do in person virtually. No, sometimes you just need to like go for it. Like, and I think in today's world, like it's hilarious that I had to hire a magician as my job, but at the same time, there are creative outlets out there, ways to kind of make this environment engaging. And a lot of people are doing interesting things in the space, but for you to get people to come to something, to stay to something and be engaged, it might not be a magician, but there are just lots of interesting options out there now for how you can engage with clients. And so it may be starting a podcast from your kitchen, but it may also be just finding things to reach clients in a new way. And that is the potential of the new world. Like we probably felt trapped in our houses that first year, but what it's led to is like these interesting ways that you can engage with the audiences you want to reach to. And at B2B, a lot of these folks are hard to get to stay in a room. Try something like an illusionist, see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. There was a virtual thing that I participated in. It was a wine tasting. And it's the same thing. You go, well, how are we going to do wine tasting if we're all remote? And the logistics were fascinating because they were like, we're shipping small bottles of wine. Everyone gets the wine. And you literally were like, all right, open up that first bottle and you start describing the smells and the tastes. And of course, everyone's like, I don't smell that. But then you have the like, oh no, I totally smell it, right? But it was that shared experience now digitally, we are all in a weird way connected from sharing that same thing, from a physical thing. So it's kind of cool that you can.
It's why I think there's this huge boom, right, in companies that do like one-to-one interactions, making sure there's associates available on the floor to show off. I bought pants that way, and it's odd to connect with somebody virtually. But I think the lesson here is that like you need to be creative and try things. And again, it doesn't have to be a magician, but there have to be things where the things that translate well are charisma, people that are, it don't have to be like a formal host. Like you want it to be authentic, but there are ways to maybe it's pushing webinars and making them a little bit different. Maybe it's having something like a virtual wine tasting. Like you have to find ways to make this experience carry on what you were probably previously doing remote. And I think for most people, like we're not completely back to normal. There is this sense of like everything's blended now. And so you have to think through creative ways to try stuff. And it may be anything, and it may come from left field, but there's something out there. And I think the inspiration is just look at what other brands are doing. This is kind of the space where like I don't think there's a rule book on this. It may be that example that you mentioned where somebody has shipped a small bottle of wine and you're having a nice evening with some prospects. It may be a magician. It may be like doing a virtual tour or something, but there are ways to reach people now that we probably hadn't previously considered that don't involve us all sitting at a bar or looking up at slides. Like there's a lot of things you can try now.
I think there's something too about, I'll refer to it as underproduced content, right? So we're so used to like spending a month to do a video and making sure like the sound is perfect and all the edits are perfect. When you do a live thing and it's underproduced, like in your magician example, like you're waiting for the magician to like trip or reveal the trick, by accident. And there's just something to be said for that. Like I remember we did, this is more in the B2C world, but during COVID, there's a local toy store and the owner's fantastic. Like he knows more about toys than anyone I've ever heard of. And he was doing 20-minute Zoom appointments for shopping where you called him on FaceTime and he would walk around the store. And it was just such a great shopping experience. Plus you had like the added pressure of like, well, I have to buy something now because the owner spent 15 minutes with me. And then they partnered with the delivery company. But I love those just underproduced moments that just have so much more authenticity as part of them.
For sure. And that's the power of, again, we're all used to video conferencing now. And a stone's throw from this is that kind of interaction or attending sort of a live stream from a brand. And I think those are really interesting storytelling moments, which are, to your point, don't really have to have the same production values. It comes down to like aligning personalities, making sure that the experience is good. Like those things take care of themselves if you pick the right people, the right moments. And that's where our jobs as content creators shift a little bit. But, you can trust the process a little bit more if at the core is something that like, you're like, oh, people are going to find this interesting. People are going to enjoy engaging with this person. People are just going to enjoy engaging with each other if you have the right mix of things. And it's a different type of work, right, than having to put out a 3-act narrative of a 5-minute video that you're having to blast out. But it's still storytelling. It's just shaping it differently.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Thanks for sharing the case study. We're now going to get into the more personal side of the podcast, Glenn. I'm going to get really close to the microphone and talk quietly now.
I'll light a candle.
But that's right. We're going to pause while the sun goes down and then bring in the mood lighting for this part. So we're going to go back in time. Tell us about your first B2B/content job that you had.
I am a refugee from journalism. And it's hilarious that young me worked in a time when I was actually majoring in broadcasting and I ended up working in newspapers right after college. And both were, taken out by the internet. At the time, it was everything that we talked about in school was around like the Tampa Tribune had done this amazing thing where like the local newspaper owned the broadcast affiliate or vice versa. And, no one saw the real threat, which was, the internet was going to give access to content in such a different and unique way. And so I worked in newspapers for a few years, but was not too familiar with marketing. The muscle is the same, but I didn't realize it until I started interviewing that, like, when you look at job descriptions and you look at the transition, like working on deadlines, trying to be creative in certain situations, doing things like blogs, like it really is the same type of work, it's just different subjects. And so it took me a while to get into marketing because a lot of people assume that you have business writing experience or that you may not be a fit without having certain types of experience. But it's like, if you look at it empirically, again, the muscles are the same. And so my lesson to people that are hiring, like you can look for people that have come from agencies or from unique roles where some of the things match, they could be a good fit for your team. Getting into it for me was a friend called me and asked if you ever heard of this company, and I had not. And I went to a job interview, and it was actually for a role as a graphic designer, which I was serviceable at, but it was a role where like you'd be designing books for the business, slides for the business, occasionally writing a press release, occasionally doing email, kind of just a Swiss Army knife. And I was grateful to enter it because newspapers at the time were not doing great. And so made that transition as a graphic designer, stuck my way in, and have been here since. And so I definitely started there, but eventually got back into more content facing roles because that was my natural skill set. But, not something I necessarily expected to fall into, but was sort of surprised when I tried to get in, like the hoops that you have to go through, because a lot of people on the hiring side really look within their same type of industry. But when it comes to our kind of roles, content roles, like those skills really do translate well.
Yeah. What's one thing that even though that world, operates very differently today, what's one thing that you took from that saying, you know what, I still use this thing I learned every day?
Oh, I definitely sort of two things. I think that we don't do enough of we had traditional editorial meetings, whether it's something our team is set up to do or it's you're coming into a new team. Like I think I like proposing is it's not, don't just take ideas at face value, debate them. And so within that world, you usually are pitching something and then you're shaping it as a group and somebody is challenging you at every step of the way, which when you're younger, you hate, but you come to appreciate that it's important to see those other people's points of view. And so I think an editorial mindset where particularly if you're working with people with different skill sets, bringing them into the conversation, they may ask things that don't feel right, but having to even explain your idea or rationalize it may make you think of looking at it in a different way. But otherwise, also working on a deadline. You feel like if you can crank out, 500 words in 35 minutes, you probably can handle whatever comes up, because in corporate America, typically things take a little bit longer, but there's more fire drills with meetings and getting ready for something to launch than having to crank something out that fast. But you do want to be ready for that pressure. And so I do value the experience of being able to be creative very quickly, but also listen to other people's ideas. And I think that's important anywhere you go. You need to respect other people's opinions and have them as part of the process, because those voices may just see something that you don't.
Yeah, the speed is very fascinating. I mean, that whole industry was built upon deadlines. If you wanted to hold off until that day to write it and turn it into your editor, great. It's something that a lot of the B2B companies I've worked with struggle with, because there is a lot of infrastructure and approvals that have to take place. And it's rare to have a company actually truly embrace it and go, you know what, guys, here are the ground rules, here are the do's, here are the don'ts. Make sure you have 2 people look at it. It's hard to get to that environment. I think the brands that are doing a good job just embrace that. And it's well, we don't have to show this to the EVP or the CEO. It's just we know the ground rules, and they know that we're creating, not that you've got to emulate a newsroom where you're breaking news, right? But it's just content shouldn't take 2-3 months to get approved. But that's hard to do.
Agreed.
Culturally, that's a really difficult thing for people to do. Easy for us to say, hard for companies to do.
But I think there are options there. If you look at what kind of content you're trying to develop, there are things that you can do to make sure the process where the approvals are needed for certain types of things, but you're working within certain things that have already been approved, where I'm sure every brand social media team in America struggles with this. I've had to go through 7 or 8 meetings to get a LinkedIn post approved. It might have been about something that was a sensitive topic that you want the words the right way, but even if for some of the breaking news stuff, you're working off of, say, a press release that's already been approved, the language is approved, and you're just echoing off of that. There's things like that where you can trust the process. If you as a group have met, you have it built in a way where you know where the lanes are, and you know the types of things that can be quickly reacted to. It's certainly one thing to make sure that you don't do anything that gets somebody sued, but you want to make sure that at the flip side, there are certain channels that just require a little bit more speed. And so you can look at avenues by which either there's somebody in place to react, or there's certain types of content that you're okay to put out there. There are ways to speed up that process. And I think it doesn't get considered because, it usually requires a different way of working. And to your point about what are lessons you can take from journalism, they were set up that way, where you had to react. And there were still editors and copywriters, people that were looking at pieces before they went live. And you can set up things that way to make sure that your brand is a little more reactive, moving a little bit faster, a little more timely, and still get good works out without there being a mistake.
I'm going to have the most big segue you've ever seen in your life. We went from the world of newspaper. I'm literally going to stop the presses in the background, and we're jumping forward to artificial intelligence. And I think there's a good discussion to be had about what does it mean for content creators. And I'm not, 4 or 5 months ago, I was in that camp of saying, is this going to have an impact? Yes or no? It was a very binary thing for me. And the more I spent researching and playing with AI, I won't even describe it that way. The impact is here to stay. And now it's just a conversation of how to use it. And I don't want to limit the conversation just to because most people think AI equals content creation. The computer is writing for me. And I think it's bigger than that. I think it's using AI to gather data, do research. So I view it as, even though people see it as content creation, I think there's way more value on the research and data integration side. So I'd love to get your thoughts on looking forward, where do you envision AI having an impact, and how does that alter the content creation engine that so many of us have built, over the years?
There's an old Seinfeld bit where he makes fun of scientists who he's saying the scientist who invented the seedless watermelon is yes, that's what I want to focus on. It's seedless melons, And I thought of that when I was looking at some of the ChatGPT stuff, because there is this, we'd spend so much time making lots of different kinds of things. I'm sure there's something that's a equivalent of seedless watermelons where we really can focus on the big picture stuff, right? And my hope is that optimistically, there's something to freeing up parts of our brain power for other more important tasks, whether it's strategic ways at looking at content strategy, development, whatever, whether it's for research, whether it's for doing some of the things like basic social copy or white spacing ideas for content ideas. It isn't coming yet to take our jobs. It's not Skynet, but it is something that can work with us as a partner. And so I think the interesting thing since ChatGPT arrived has been the tips and tricks have been a lot of really people focusing on kinds of things to prompt, to write an email, to write social copy, to write things that help your day. But really, it comes down to how you work. And I think there's lessons there to kind of get familiar with it. Everyone should play with it and look at its potential, not just laugh at it writing like a hip hop Bible verse. That stuff's awesome and fun. But
Yeah.
there's a million things that are entertaining, but look at how you work and figure out places that it can plug in. Because I think for me, the potential around research and helping me think of things quickly that I would have spent several days working on, that's where it lets my content muscle just create content because it's fed properly. It's not wasting time on other things. It's not solving the seedless watermelon crisis. It's trying to focus on things that I really should be focused on. And so I think that's going to be hopefully the immediate impact and long-term, particularly as we've shifted from a world where I think it used to be safe to say content is king. And then the rise of metrics-based things, everybody wants to understand performance and how things are doing. And it felt like probably in the past decade that content was taking a bit of a back seat because it's just well, are we reaching the audience? Are things reacting? I think you can now look at all the data that you have and properly look at, are you getting the right message for the right audience? What are things that we could be talking about that we're not? What are people talking about that we're not talking about? With AI, there's some automation things that we could do now to learn some of that stuff. But with AI, you can have someone that's effectively like a virtual analyst helping you figure out some of those opportunities. And so content can kind of, rise to the challenge a little bit and not be generic AI produced stuff. It can actually be something that is created in partnership with these tools to be more interesting, to be more impactful. And so broadly speaking, it makes us better at our jobs and it can simplify some of the things that we do day to day now. But my real hope is that, it gives me time to think about those bigger topics, those bigger ideas, and sink my teeth into those versus having to crank out the same 25 emails for campaign launch or social copy that really is going to be kind of derivative of the same. There's places like that where on the production side, it's valuable now, but currently and long term, it's a partner to help us research, find things that we're not thinking about and kind of help us ideate.
Yeah. It's an interesting take. I mean, I could see how the lift of creating is certainly easier now with AI. And I wonder if does that force the content creator, the writer, or the producer, whatever the role is that can do these things now, does that force you to be a better storyteller, a better problem solver, where before it was so hard to create everything. So that was 80% of the effort. It was hey, that writer's working on that piece, don't talk to them because they need 10 hours to do that. When I've done things using AI, I find myself being better at structuring content because you just have to the creation side is easier now. So you're just forced into, is this the right flow? And one thing that I've used a lot for is researching pain points. I'm a big believer that you've used this earlier is content, should solve a problem. And to me, like before I dig into creating something now, I just say, hey, AI, can you list the top 15 problems that this type of customer or, a tech company in this market, what are some of the challenges that they might be up against? And that is to where I see the real value of all this stuff. Oh, that's interesting. Like, I didn't know that. And then let's say I find a pain point, and then I might say, all right, can you research data that supports this pain point? And then that pulls in sources. You still have that responsibility to say, all right, well, now there's 6 sources. Which one is most credible? But yeah, the ability to do that, besides like the days of endlessly just almost like going to the library, right? Like, yeah, I'm gonna write a paper. So I'm gonna go to the library for 2 hours and get lost and just kind of like hopefully and we called that researching, like that was like, no, that's researching. You do that for 2 hours. It's a fascinating world.
To be able to react faster when you're doing the research is invaluable. Like if I'm spending time diving into SEO topics and trying to figure out what might connect, if I'm trying to look at thought leadership, feel like what hasn't been covered, like there's just some places there where hopefully you, the content team, can get to it sooner. And certainly I think that ChatGPT or GPT-3 now eventually transitioning to GPT-4, there's going to be potential for it to write large swaths of marketing jobs, but I think that it doesn't lessen the importance of what we do. It just means that some parts of our job will be hopefully creating higher concept stuff, things that are a little more personal, a little more authentic. And I think a lot of people would be happy to focus on that. And if you are someone if your skill set is the blocking and tackling, the things that are just I'm good at cranking out 20 posts for LinkedIn or for something like that, like, think about how you can be someone who develops the prompts or makes the engine work, because it still comes down to, what you put into it is what you get out of it, right? At least right now. And so I think that there has to be an expertise around, what you're trying to do, how it's applied, how what you get back is shaped into what you need. It's going to make all that faster regardless. Like that's what we know for a fact. But again, it kind of comes down to like your example, if you're talking to different clients, like it's helping you speed up the process of learning something that they might be dealing with. For me in a content development role, it might help me quickly get to topics we should be talking about, but we're not. And I can, some parts of that journey, inevitably for an effective content journey, as we talked about with the case studies, you want to try different types of things and tell that story in different mediums. Maybe ChatGPT or future versions of this can help you reshape that source content, but it's still based on something. And that's where I think our brain power, our skill set, our muscle is still useful.
Yeah.
Some of the higher concept stuff, I hope feeds it, or the prompt feeds it, or our brain structures it in a way that makes it part of it's a tool, not something that replaces what we do.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated with the unintended consequences of AI. So there's clearly all these benefits, but there's a downside that will ultimately emerge. And one thing I've been playing around in my head with is, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we started with the simplistic view of media. It was a handful of big media companies that controlled broadcast print, certainly with like the start of cable TV and like satellite radio, like it just fragmented, right? So now there's so much information. There's not as much rigor as it relates to editorial standards and fact checking. So to me, I can envision a potential world where we go down this path of now media companies have more value to show as it relates to their standards. So do you have broadcast companies that say, we are taking a stance, we do not generate anything AI. So you have this is our fact-checked, sourced approach to journalism. Will that fragment the media world? Will people now, let's say we live in this world where we don't know the information and how accurate it is. We do that for 5 or 10 years. Is it now, do we get frustrated by that? And now it's like we lean into this older version that we all grew up in. There's also a funny joke I saw recently related to the downside of using Google to find what potential illness you have by typing in symptoms. And the joke goes something like, well, it depends on what disease has the best SEO performance. Like is one disease beating another if the symptoms are better or worse? And are we going to live in that world where it's kind of like, I don't know, like my brain doesn't like that. I want to be in the safe world, So what are your thoughts on, like, do you see long term, will it get worse? Is there more fragmentation, or what do you think might happen?
I would probably feel most comfortable speaking to my fears and or optimism around like the quality of content and the truthfulness or the fact checking part is something I'm very much interested in. I legit didn't know until very recently there were virtual influencers, and it's something I've spent a lot of time researching recently about AI generated influencers. And it's just hilarious how engaging they are or how much they mirror someone who's doing it in real life, and meeting that at some point it's going to be very quick for AI to understand what we like to consume and what we like to enjoy and produce, all kinds of content that we'll probably have a gut reaction to, like, this is probably written by a bot, or this is an image that's a little too close to perfect. I hope that humanity reacts to that and has sort of a yearning for more pure forms of content, meaning like real photography, very creative, interesting, high concept content. I don't know if it'll go that way because McDonald's and other brands, forgive me, I shouldn't mention brands, sorry. I think my hope is that there is this reaction to sort of the wave of generated content that's coming, where you can kind of tell, that something is a helpful article or a generated image where you're like, okay, my gut knows that that's fake. And so it makes us all yearn for purer content, the content that, was handcrafted or was a unique personal story or photography or video that was created by real storytellers. I hope that there's this reverse reaction where we suddenly want that stuff. I don't know if that's the case because fast food chains are still a business. So I think it'll be interesting because optimistically, my hope is we'll be able to tell the difference. If there is a way for AI to work to make even generated content more truthful, whatever that means, that's going to be a challenge because of how we all view that subject. But my hope is there is some way to kind of like weed out the different kinds of content that are out there, because I think what's been crazy for me, having been a journalist, I can still remember the first time that one of my friends who was like an accountant was like, "Oh, I'm a managing editor for a food blog." And I was like, what are you talking about? And so I remember feeling like there was a point in the past, 10, 15, 20 years where everyone became content producers, and having viewed myself as such, like you're very snarky about it at first, or like you have alarm bells. You're like, well, but the truth is everybody has a point of view or opinion. And I laughed at that food blog, but some of, the things they were doing were pretty good or things that we all can identify with. And that's sort of how I felt about AI in the beginning. But when you see what it's capable of, you just hope there's the separation of like, let it have its role, let it create things that are useful in a certain way. But like, it's not writing War and Peace. It's not creating, hopefully, any Marvel movies anytime soon. So I would hope there is some reaction for us as consumers to what comes out next, to really separate and be like, this is useful, we like it, we get it, we know it's fake, or we know it's teaching me something, or it's automated in some way. But we still yearn for real things, real stories, real personal and authentic human moments, whether that's through video, written word, film, media, something. Like my hope is that we still want that. And for brands, that means that it's as important as ever to be authentic. And those types of stories, that kind of content, that work needs to be done by human hands, maybe informed by AI, but don't let AI, replace your interns or whoever you have doing this.
Yeah, nice. All right. I'm going to end the show by reminding myself. I'm going to ask Siri to set a reminder for 30 years, and we can both listen to this podcast, and we can go, all right, how far off were we on where it was? Or in AI, in 10 years, something else will come out. So silly humans thinking about AI is nothing, Anyway, Glenn, I really enjoyed your perspective. You've got just really deep experience in the world of content. So I always am impressed by your knowledge and your perspective on the art and science of how we go about creating the content and telling stories. So thank you again for joining us today.
Well, hopefully in 30 years, you and I are on an iceberg having been pushed out to sea from, AI drones because they don't need us anymore. And like everything is covered. There are no jobs for marketers, and it's a space where we have to live in the wild. I hope that's not where we're doing that podcast, which would be with like a tin can and something very natural, because I think that's what everyone's fear is. And I hope this is a subject that, people dive into. And, the lesson is for us as we debate the possibilities. Honestly, half the battle is just get in there and play with it, because you should be part of that change, not the two of us being pushed out to sea on an iceberg. I think it's better if you join the revolution as opposed to let it affect you. So yeah, I look forward to that 30-year conversation, and I hope that we're at least a little bit right.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.